Chapter 61.
You sure about this, boss?
Mr. Mammon wasn't too happy, but Leopold had made his decision. It felt like he had made it long ago, and was only now seeing the consequences. The old man chortled quietly to himself, a wry smile gracing his lips.
Good heavens, no. I've never been less certain about something in my long and storied life. But I think that it makes the most sense, and have no fear, I'll return to the gentle sounds of Crimsolino's duskin voice and your brazen showmanship before long.
Crimsolino had been flying overhead, or trying to. The tension in the air was proving too much yet again, and in between attempting to reassure him with her own laughter and keep airborne, she could not manage both. One of the constantly whirling searchlights, which, Leopold had been surprised to learn, were actually colored by the larger boulder folk, who would serve as a lens for the light lancing into the sky, illuminated her as she managed to find Talonhold in the ruined roads. The Duchess hopped from claw to claw, and it was an odd sight indeed, to see her worried so.
Leopold, know that if you do not return, I shall fetch your eyes myself. And I have no desire to do that. So do not keep Mammon and myself waiting, or we shall grow entirely too fond of the plebeian culture of the place.
Before the old man could reply, she vanished back into the expanse of tunnels that permeate the ground below. The place was a mess of old constructions and new ones, and some seemed to have breached the larger complex the island already had. Mr. Mammon shot him a salute and a sad, half-moon grin, then followed behind her, sliding down the ladder as he went. And Leopold stared at his new companions.
So, tell me, precisely, what we're retrieving from these cavernous complexes of yours. I'm afraid I'm not half as quick as you lot, so we should get started before too long. I do not wish to slow you down.
The plant girl thing snickered. It was an irritating laugh, but Leopold resolved himself to it. Her clumpy leaf-like mass of hair reminded him of time spent on his own in this place, but she did not seem intent on causing harm, and indeed, her outhaled fist was definitely a gesture of courtesy. Leopold cautiously held out his hand. It stung a bit, but somehow he felt he had passed some hidden test of some kind.
Righteous. All right, Wrinklebro. You really think you can do what Lorelei needs to get the Wuxi magic highway going from Yadaway to Thisaway? I am certain, and far better to risk your food simply staying put than for me to handle the link here, make a mess of matters and send it to some far-forsaken realm. Though? Will you do me a favor and refer to me by name? Leopold is a good name, you know. I came to show humility, not humiliate myself.
The paint thinner scented young man with the bandaged hands and messy hair shook his head before idly massaging his neck. He was smiling too, though it was a bit more restrained.
Leopold. Look, I don't know the full details on why everyone doesn't like you. I mean, I've got a lot of ideas, but I'm not really one to hold grudges. So, let's do this right. I'm Zhao, this is Sams, Zemby, and this is Bones.
Zhao could already tell from the way Leopold gave a resigned sigh that this was going to be the trickiest kind of job, one where you're fighting not only time and the environment, but the short temper of a cranky old man. Still, Leopold soon replaced his look of exasperation with something resembling a normal human smile, and that was a start. Ahead of them the road had been absolutely devastated, not just by the battles of the great dragons, but by lack of maintenance, and whatever this was. Whatever was probably a decent enough way to describe it, Zhao thought. Little weird boggles of golden light were hanging everywhere now, sort of like someone had taken the pillars of light so recently streaming through the trees, put them into some kind of circular mold or wine press, and frozen the orbs in open air. Occasionally they burst open like wounds, and the golden ichor within trickled into the earth below. Leopold muttered something unpleasant and indecipherable, and a bubble of red light surrounded them. Bones hummed to himself pleasantly, seeming nonplussed by the possibly hostile, possibly harmless environment around them.
Useful trick. Odd to say, but I feel as if I've seen it before, somewhere. Have we met?
The old man seemed shocked, and for a minute some strange look came across him. He looked younger, more confused and less certain of himself, perhaps even a bit scared. But he did not look as if he could place bones at all, either by his presence or voice, and finally, Leopold just gave a curt shake of his graying hair.
Quite sorry. I'm afraid I have known many esteemed gentlemen of words in my time, and though I am sure you are one such character, I do not recall you. I am certain I would, if I did.
Yet he did not sound certain, not entirely. Wrestling for something to break the ice with, Zhao cautiously reached through the barrier and grabbed one of the floating branches. It felt about the right size and shape for a baton. He was quite surprised to see that Leopold looked horrified at his actions.
Good heavens, boy! Are you quite mad? I won't deny your bravery, but...
Ah, damn! He had only stuck his arm through the barrier for a moment, but he could see red incisions rising up and forming nasty welts. Whatever nulled his senses was doing its usual work all too well, though he couldn't feel anything more than a slight tingle to warn him of how bad it looked, and all the more.
It's no big deal. I'm not feeling entirely myself at the moment, but that just means I'm resistant to pain.
Zhao grinned from ear to ear, meaning to cut off any further biting commentary by Leopold, but...
How peculiar. Do you know, you're not the first person I've met with afflictions like this.
Leopold was smiling as well. Bones, who had been listening very patiently the entire time, seemed desperate to try jog his own vast memory. Even if it wasn't exactly Leopold he was thinking of, the skeleton had lived enough lives to qualify as an encyclopedia of forgotten times, after all. It was Sembi that responded though. She had been simmering with the dangerous energy of excitement ever since they had begun walking, though it was hard not to see why. The plants here were warped and made weird beyond recognition. Sometimes trees were flipped upside down, or the roots of deep bulbs had fractured and seemed almost like grasping hands, retreating from oddly gooey soil. For someone kin to plants, even the ones that didn't speak audibly, nor look for silver linings, nor found a way to make you laugh while you were at your lowest. Maybe this was a bit like hell.
Do you think you could fix Zhao up, maybe?
Weirdest still, though, was the soil. Even though Zhao didn't feel much of anything right now, he felt it right beneath his feet, as if he wasn't wearing very battered sneakers and as if he had never lost sensation in the first place. It wasn't a pleasant feeling.
Ha, well, don't get too excited. I would have to know how the affliction came into being. It wouldn't have anything to do with your affectations or affections.
Wow. The way that guy waggled those eyebrows. Maybe he really was a monster. Zhao shot him an equally intense eyebrow waggle in return, hoping that his response was sardonic enough to put an end to the old man's villainy, but...
Nah. We don't know what it is. Ha, ha. I mean, it does have some upsides, free fists of justice and all that, but...
Zambi gave a little shrug made all the more impressive because she was pretty diminutive herself.
I'd rather have Zhao feeling 100%.
That's all she said. There wasn't any joke, or attempt to on Zambi's part to plead or rationalize her case. Just a quiet request from someone who didn't know what else to do. Zhao felt guilty and powerless and looked away. The sky was a deep orange, with dots of red, blue, and some color he couldn't quite put to mind. It was unpleasant to stare at too long though, his eyes kind of itched, so he stared back at Leopold, who was scratching his beard.
So I see. What lucky fellows you are, then.
The group walked in silence for the better part of an hour.
There was a king, once. He suffered from the ravages of a wasting disease, and yet still lived with all the honor and courage one could expect of nobility, true nobility, that is. It isn't so bad to have an unknowable burden. In some ways, it is what we can use to strengthen ourselves. Something to constantly push the boundaries of.
Leopold paused, sighing, and leant against his cane.
Perhaps. But Zhao isn't a king, though he is very kingly.
Bones interrupted politely, but firmly.
He's a young man, with a young man's worries and cares ahead of him. If you do have any guesses, I know we'd be glad to hear them.
The forest, if you could even call it that, opened up before them. Thankfully, the roads had been completely clear so far, no strange creatures or hellish whirlwinds of dust and light had appeared and roared towards them, spitting flash fires and debris. But suddenly Zhao could see straight to their cavernous home and the mountain crags above, and where the rocks were familiar, the layout of the land and the open sky had changed places entirely. Fragments of great stone were levitating perilously in the heavens above, occasionally twirling, and occasionally falling. When they fell, they did not shatter, they burst into tiny fragments, which for lack of a better word began to walk at ridiculously high speeds towards objects, seemingly at random. And those objects then had tiny, otherwise imperceptible holes bored straight through them. Ting. Ting 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 ting. It was like a miniaturized hailstorm had engulfed them, hundreds of the tiny fragments bouncing off of Leopold's shielding as they pressed onwards. Eventually the sound became normal, though never any more pleasant.
I do have my guesses. It's probably a condition of having been in a world similar to our own, but dissimilar enough to cause some kind of irregularity response. My knowledge is rooted more in the arcane side of things, but, no matter how comfortable he and I are here, make no mistake. We are foreign to this world, and not all would welcome us.
Leopold seemed fairly nonplussed by the barrage of particulates, talking as mildly as if they were a gentle spring breeze instead of a constant stream of stone, only one errant pellet away from slicing into bone or puncturing a lung.
Is that area in the mountains where you all live then? How odd, I actually sent.
And Leopold pursed his lips, and stared at the ground, and went quiet. Zhao wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he had a few ideas. It was weird, you know. For all he had heard about the guy, Leopold just seemed like a kind of angry and kind of snide old man, but not evil, or anything like that. And yet...
Well, we wanted to kind of make it so that there was at least one free and open settlement in the area. So, that didn't really pan out. A lot of stuff happened, you know, we ended up going further and further into the caves. Ordinary growing pains.
Zhao talked a mile a minute, trying to channel the spirit of the panic hour classes held when they weren't certain whether there'd be a class to teach if they stayed put. Miss Bada had the perfect blend of unflinching, calm tone and ability to string words together quickly without jumbling up, and he knew he had already failed on both accounts. He was talking too quickly, and it was obvious he didn't know what to say, or how to feel. Had this guy really, by proxy, ordered some of what they had seen? And what did that mean about? Leopold had stopped moving, and was just staring at the ground.
If you would care to leave me here, I do not mind.
His voice was barely above a whisper.
Snap out of it. Geez, you're worse than Zhao was that one time he had to deal with a lot of rough stuff. Okay. Leopold. I'm using your name, so listen carefully.
Zambi placed her hands at the back of her head and stared up at the branches hanging from the sky in a loose, almost crystalline web of tangled shapes, staring back down at them.
Whatever you've done before, there'll come a time we can talk about it, but... we really could use your help right now. I mean, I'm kinda scrawny, Bones is really dependable but can't run too fast, and Zhao totally could run there and back, but do you know why he isn't? Because we need your help right now.
The old man shot her a cautious glance, listening, but only just.
There are people alive right now who are depending on you. And if people have died before because of your actions and inactions, maybe you could try to prevent more death, now. I asked you earlier if you were on board with this, are you righteous?
And, suddenly, slowly, Leopold began to laugh. It was a very quiet kind of laughter, as much at himself as anyone else.
Righteous, HRMN. I don't know, but I might as well try it. Yes, I suppose I'm righteous. Shall we proceed?
Then, as naturally as if they hadn't stopped at all, their four-person convoy continued through the hanging woods. Occasionally, Leopold would stop to ask a question about something, usually one of the landmarks they had built. Most were damaged and ripped into weird chunks, some so neatly that it looked as if high-precision tools had quartered them for some kind of scientific purpose. But even damaged as they were, their tiny goal of commemoration and memory all but obsolete, Leopold seemed fascinated by them.
We just wanted to do something nice. This was before all this happened, but think of all the ruins and empty buildings you can find across the island. Some are inhabited, sure, but there's so many that have just been left to be forgotten. So, on some level, I guess it seemed worth asking if it wasn't better to start with a building or piece without a purpose, but try to construct enough that people could assign their own.
And there had been practical points, too, places to rest, and find your way. But Leopold seemed to know all that well enough, and the old man was pretty on point about art. What he liked was a completely different field compared to what Zhao was used to, and a lot of the stuff he talked about seemed weird. He had read the irregular comics but seemed to think they were a book, a movie, a stage play. A stage play, honestly. How often did you see stuff like that in the yards?
I think I've figured it out.
Bones began at length as they approached the second of two rivers that hadn't existed until the turn of the age, the water within which was such a horrifying shade of red that even if it were completely harmless, Zhao didn't particularly want to risk a way to find out.
You aren't the sort of man I think I've met before. But somehow, I feel like we've written each other letters at some point. Not because we have, even. But you know, that same feeling I get when I read people criticizing a book I've grown fond of. That's what you remind me of.
Anyone else would have made it sound like an insult, but the fond sense of satisfaction in Bones' rattling voice was unmistakable. He was happy to have identified what he found familiar about Leopold, happy to have the opportunity to remind himself of lives prior. The old skeleton took happiness where he could find it. Perhaps it was one of the traits Zhao admired about him the most.
Well, I suppose I've been called worse, huh?
Leopold wasn't laughing, but panting, though he might be a dapper dresser and witty enough, and he certainly looked well preserved.
We need to take a breather. It might not hurt to catch our bearings a little bit. I can't even tell if it's dawn or dusk.
Zhao announced with a smile.
Easy peasy, Zhao. It's dusk, since we've got a healthy amount of moody darkness and daylight. We're probably the first people to see something like this, so it's probably hella rare, too. Possibly, Zams. But couldn't this have happened before? I mean.
It was a thought he had been having, and couldn't shake. This clearly wasn't the usual fourth season, and nor was it some occasional phenomena that anyone could pin down. Maybe it was related to the dragons, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was some other power or player, maybe it wasn't. But, what if it was in some way cyclical? What if the slate, as it were?
Well, that's a pretty terrifying thought. I think I'll just erase it from my head for right now. Boop. Erased. Actually, scratch that, replaced. How are we gonna get over that?
The chasm opening up before them resembled nothing more than a giant maw in the earth, sucking in water and soil over rock like crags of teeth, and in between them, tiny cylindrical lances of green light were floating contently. And occasionally frying small particulates of water or dirt with even tinier streams of emerald, from which only smoke and heat escaped. Leopold stared past it, shaking his head.
Bah! Do you know, you can find magic most everywhere. The ambient stuff has a nasty tendency to cling to desperate things, like memories and strong emotions. You can't be rid of it easily. It's almost as if it's trying to create, or perhaps recreate something here. Does that mean you've got a plan?
Zhao asked in between chucking a small stone at the chasm. In less than a minute, not even a mote of the island granite was left.
Yes. If I'm wrong, do me a favor and put in a good word for me. I have a lot to apologize for, after all.
And with that, Leopold walked right through, and across, the chasm.
Disappointing, but not unexpected. I think most of the phenomena we've seen so far are harmless, because they're not real. I wouldn't normally bet my life on it, but... Can't you feel it? This whole region feels as if it is nothing more than an attempt to harness something else.
His smugness was undone slightly by the grid of minuscule green beams apparently scorching everything around him, but doing no apparent damage whatsoever. Indeed, the overall effect was almost as if a great number of harmless light pointers were being flared at the old man. Bones cautiously went first, arms out wide in the possibility that the old man's luck had been a fluke. But it held for Bones, and for Zemby as she cartwheeled across, and Zhao as he followed close behind her, shaking his head and laughing. What else could you do, after all?
Will it get worse, do you think?
Asked Bones pensively, and Leopold frowned.
Possibly. I'm not sure if this is even consistent, or a good forebear of what's yet to come. We should just remain cautious. If any heroic sacrifices come up, do not look to me, guilt does not equate to foolishness. And avoiding them is preferable to both.
His lips curled upward slyly.
Regardless, am I the first to arrive in your old home? How auspicious!
And it was auspicious, though not because he had gotten there first. The cavern complex was mostly untouched on the inside. If it didn't get worse, or indeed, if the weird events improved over time, they could definitely salvage things. Zhao couldn't help himself, getting fired up was the best way to fight off worry. Hope was a good shield, but an ever better one was taking action. And if you were doing so with your friends, well...
Okay. So, Leopold. There are multiple plots, the ones outside are kind of screwed up, apparently, but you could try sending them over and see what happens. But we have 2 floors of the caves reserved for growing fungus and lichen and squash.
Leopold didn't even blink, nor ask how they had managed to grow squash in the cavern interiors. Privately, Zhao was just a little disappointed.
It's not me who decides that, I'm just to ape what Lorelei will be doing. If I attempted to work my own magic, with my own methods, the result would likely be similar to the ambient magic. You would need a true master to harness such magic. Not a master of imitations, such as myself.
And yet, he had added the word master quite flippantly. What a piece of work. Chuckling, and smiling in spite of himself, Zhao carefully began to dig out things that looked useful. The gaming table it'd have to come, because running out of things to do might be more damaging in the long run than running out of supplies, near the end. He had seen the way people got when they had gone too long without something to take their mind off, in the yards. And he didn't want to see it again. Plus, it could always be scrapped. And the planters, too. In the corner of his vision, he could see Bones and Zemby doing much the same, rummaging around for things with a speed that impressed him. Maybe one of the reasons he had felt so powerless recently was taking for granted the work they did. What an odd, and yet solid revelation. Smiling, he had just finished freeing up an unused portrait frame, and carefully setting it near the blasphemous horn, which was definitely coming with them, when he saw the red light, vicious and unpleasant, bubbling into being near Leopold. Every line was incredibly angular and precise, it kind of fit his personality. And unlike Lorelei's, despite all that pretense, it was also kind of clumsy. Leopold kept sweating and frowning and swiveling his hands, rotating the gate around, but it eventually stuck in the air with a satisfying hiss, and roared open with the sound of 1,000 different voices, beckoning distantly. Which was kind of reassuring, in an odd way. Sure, they were disembodied and ghostly voices. But there wasn't a hint of malice in any of them. Zhao glanced at Leopold again, and the man was smiling serenely. He looked pretty pleased with himself.
Right on.
Zhao whispered to himself, and began to lug his portion of their supplies over. They were going to do this, he knew it from the way Zemby was looking at him with a mix of certainty and anticipation. And the gate interior pulsated with an odd and unearthly, but soothing light, and it shone like a lantern that alternated with the bioluminescence of the cavern fungi. Chapter end.